Chapter 6. Curtains of Deception. Charlotte Vane, a celebrated stage actress, was famed for her transformative performances and dramatic flair. Her portrait in Hargrave's portfolio depicted her on stage, holding a dagger in one hand and a mask in the other, her expression fierce and enigmatic. Holmes knew the symbolism was deliberate and feared what the architect had planned. Holmes and Watson arrived at the Drury Lane Theatre, where Vane was rehearsing a new production, The Lady's Folly. The grand building echoed with the sounds of actors' voices and the occasional applause from the director. They found Charlotte Vane in her dressing room, a stunning woman in her mid-30s with striking features and an air of intensity. She regarded Holmes with skepticism. "To what do I owe this interruption?" she asked, her voice carrying the practiced precision of the stage. Holmes wasted no time. "Miss Vane, you are in grave danger. Several individuals depicted in this portfolio," he displayed Hargrave's work, "have been killed in a manner reflecting their portraits. You are the next target." Charlotte examined the painting, her lips tightening. "This is unsettling. Hargrave mentioned this commission to me once, but I never saw the finished piece until now. Have you experienced anything unusual recently?" Holmes asked. "Actors always receive threats," she replied. "It comes with the profession." But, she hesitated. "Yesterday, I found a broken dagger prop in my dressing room, its blade painted red. I assumed it was a prank." "Not a prank," Holmes said gravely. "A warning." Holmes and Watson stayed through the rehearsal, watching from the shadows of the auditorium. Vane's performance was mesmerizing, her every movement calculated to captivate. As she delivered her final monologue, Holmes's attention was drawn to the lighting rig above the stage. "Watson," he murmured, "do you see that technician? His movements are erratic." Watson followed Holmes's gaze to a man climbing the scaffolding. Holmes was already on the move, darting backstage. Watson followed, struggling to keep pace as Holmes ascended the ladder to the rigging. The technician was tampering with the weights and pulleys that controlled the stage's massive chandelier. Holmes reached him just as he released a lever, sending the chandelier plummeting toward the stage. "Watson!" Holmes shouted. "Warn her!" Watson raced to the stage, shouting a warning. Charlotte dove out of the way just as the chandelier crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The technician attempted to flee but was intercepted by Holmes. The man fought with surprising ferocity, but Holmes subdued him with a precise strike. Backstage, the man was restrained and interrogated. "Who is your employer?" Holmes demanded. The man smirked. "You're too late. The architect's work is almost complete." Holmes studied the man's face, committing every detail to memory. Among his belongings, Holmes found another note bearing the Compass and Vines insignia. Charlotte, still shaken, thanked Holmes and Watson. "You've saved my life. I don't know how to repay you." Holmes inclined his head. "The greatest repayment is your continued vigilance. The architect thrives on precision and theatrics. They will not stop until their tableau is complete." Watson opened the portfolio to the next portrait, Sir Lionel Graves, a famed historian depicted in his study, surrounded by ancient tomes and maps. "A scholar," Watson observed. What could the architect have in store for him? Holmes's expression was grim. "We must find out before it is too late." Chapter 7. The historian's haunting. Sir Lionel Graves was a preeminent historian, celebrated for his meticulous research into ancient civilizations. His portrait in Hargrave's portfolio depicted him surrounded by towering bookshelves, a map of the British Empire unfurled on his desk, and a quill in his hand. Yet, there was a sinister shadow in the background, a faint outline of a hooded figure holding an ancient scroll. Holmes and Watson traveled to Graves's estate in Bloomsbury, a stately home whose walls were lined with artifacts and manuscripts. Graves greeted them in his study, a bespectacled man with graying hair and an air of academic detachment. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, shaking their hands. "Your letter intrigued me. How can I assist you?" Holmes held up the portfolio. "Sir Graves, your life is in danger. This portrait is part of a sequence linked to a series of murders, each victim killed in a manner symbolic of their depiction. You are the next target." Graves adjusted his glasses, studying the portrait. Fascinating. And disturbing. But I assure you, I am hardly the sort to draw the ire of a killer. The killer, whom we call the architect, is meticulous and thematic, Holmes replied. Their motive remains unclear, but the pattern is unmistakable. Have you experienced anything unusual? Graves hesitated. A few nights ago, I received an anonymous package. Inside was an ancient-looking scroll. I thought it a hoax, but the text, it seemed to describe my own death in chilling detail. Where is the scroll now? Holmes asked. Graves retrieved it from his desk. The parchment was brittle, the text written in a language Holmes recognized as Latin. He translated aloud, "The scholar will fall by the tools of his trade, the weight of knowledge crushing him." Watson shivered. Ominous words, Holmes. Indeed, Holmes said. Sir Graves, do you trust your staff? Graves frowned. Implicitly. Most have been with me for years. Trust, but verify, Holmes murmured. Watson, we must secure the house tonight. That evening, Holmes and Watson inspected the study, noting the precarious placement of the heavy bookshelves and the chandelier above Graves's desk. Holmes's deductions led him to the ladder used to reach the higher shelves. This rung, he said, pointing to a worn wooden step, has been partially sawn through. A fall from this height would be fatal. Watson's expression darkened. They meant for him to die here, surrounded by his life's work. Holmes nodded. The architect's genius lies in their macabre symbolism. We must confront this directly. In the dead of night, Holmes and Watson lay in wait. The study was silent except for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock. Hours passed, and Watson struggled to remain awake. Suddenly, the faint creak of a floorboard broke the silence. A shadowy figure entered the study, their movements deliberate. The intruder approached the bookshelves, a crowbar in hand, and began loosening the bolts that secured them. Holmes leapt from his hiding spot. Hold it right there. The intruder turned, attempting to flee, but Watson tackled them to the ground. Holmes lit a lamp, revealing the face of a young man, a clerk employed by Graves. Why? Graves demanded, his voice shaking. The clerk sneered. You profited from our ancestors' work, Sir Graves. Your so-called history is theft, and it's time you paid for it. Holmes examined the crowbar and the clerk's belongings, finding yet another note bearing the Compass and Vines insignia. You are but a pawn in a larger game, he said. The architect exploits your grievances for their own twisted ends. The next morning, Graves expressed his gratitude. I owe you my life, Mr. Holmes. I had no idea my work had made such enemies. Holmes nodded. You were targeted not for your actions but for your place in this grim tableau. The architect remains at large, and their designs grow darker. Watson opened the portfolio to the next portrait, a musician playing a violin, their face partially obscured by a mask. Another artist, Watson noted. Who is this? Adrian Moreau, Holmes said. A virtuoso violinist. We must find him at once. Chapter 8. The final note. Adrian Moreau, a violinist whose talent was described as transcendent, was the next subject in Hargrave's chilling portfolio. The portrait showed him mid-performance, his violin's bow almost ablaze with intensity, while a shadowed figure loomed in the background. Holmes and Watson hurried to St. James's Hall, where Moreau was preparing for a recital. The venue's opulent interior was alive with the murmurs of musicians tuning their instruments. Holmes and Watson found Moreau in his dressing room, a striking man with piercing blue eyes and an aura of quiet intensity. Holmes wasted no time. Mr. Moreau, I must warn you. Your life is in grave danger. Moreau set down his violin, his expression skeptical. Danger? I have no enemies, only admirers. Yet you are the subject of this portrait, Holmes said, showing him the portfolio. The artist, Ambrose Hargrave, is at the center of a series of murders. Victims are killed in ways reflecting their depictions in his work. Moreau's face paled as he studied the painting. This is unsettling. But why me? Holmes replied, the motives remain unclear, but the architect orchestrates each killing as a twisted reflection of their victims' lives. Your performance tonight may present the opportunity they need. As the recital began, Holmes and Watson positioned themselves in the shadows of the grand hall. The audience sat enraptured as Moreau played, his music weaving a spell over the room. Suddenly, Holmes's sharp eyes caught movement in the rafters. A figure was manipulating a pulley system that held an enormous chandelier above the stage. "Watson," Holmes whispered, to the stage. "Warn Moreau." Holmes darted toward the backstage area, scaling a ladder to confront the saboteur. Watson rushed to the edge of the stage, waving his arms to draw Moreau's attention. "Stop playing," Watson shouted. Moreau faltered, lowering his violin just as the chandelier plunged toward the stage. It crashed mere inches from where he stood, sending shards of crystal flying. Holmes grappled with the saboteur in the rafters, narrowly avoiding a knife slash. The intruder, a wiry man with an intense glare, shouted, "You can't stop the architect." With a calculated strike, Holmes disarmed the man, who tumbled to the ground below. Watson and several stagehands restrained him. Holmes descended, his expression cold. "You are a pawn, nothing more. Tell us where the architect is." The man sneered but remained silent. In his pocket, Holmes found a torn piece of sheet music marked with Hargrave's signature motif, the compass and vines insignia. The next day, Moreau thanked Holmes and Watson, visibly shaken. "You have saved me, but this spectre still haunts us all." Holmes nodded. "Indeed. The architect grows bolder, but their web is beginning to unravel." Watson opened the portfolio to the next portrait, a celebrated author surrounded by books, her quill dripping ink onto the page. "Our next subject,